Welcome to Oh God What Now, the politics podcast that is not afraid to ask the big questions, just as long as you're not expecting any big answers. I'm Alex Andreu. On today's show, Labour's manifesto is out. Is it too much? Is it too little? Is it just right? We'll take a look at its virtues, sins and omissions. And with Reform capturing every headline on the basis of a 1-point lead over the Tories in just one poll, are we over-polling this election? And how do we know which numbers to trust? Let's meet the panel. First up on the panel this week is journalist and author Marie Leconte. Hi, Marie.
Hello.
Marie, I see you have been enjoying the Men's Euro 2024 vocally and vigorously.
Oh, there's so much more like xenophobia where that came from, yeah.
Okay, so unless something strange happens in the group stages, I'm not going to go through the different scenarios. If England do meet France, it will probably be in the final. What then?
Oh, no, it's very easy. And actually, I've really not been a coward about this because very early on I explained it to my family. France cannot win the Euros this year because the final of the Euros this year is on the 14th of July, aka Bastille Day. Like, Emmanuel Macron would wank on television. Like, he would wank himself to death on live national French television in France on the 14th of July. So they cannot, and it's my country and I love them, they can't win. But if anything, they can't even reach the final because I think that would be very bad as well. So France needs to be eliminated at the semi-finals. I will be supporting them up until that point. So that's actually a very straightforward answer from me, I think.
Okay, so what if they make it further than that and England don't?
They still need to lose.
Anyone but France.
Oh, yeah, generally anyone but France, yeah. No, so I think
bloody hell, Marie. Bloody.
14th of... Have you met French people? Like, at the best of times,
listen,
you know?
I ask completely self-interestedly because I have experienced this some years back in the Euro 2024. England were playing Greece in a very crucial qualifier. And suddenly all my friends of decades were viewing me as a complete traitor.
But I think so. I sort of had that, what was it, the last final of the Euros, actually. Obviously, we lost to Italy. And like, my entire family was like, oh, yeah, obviously we wanted Italy to win. It's like, I'm sorry, you have no connection whatsoever to Italy. Your darling daughter / sister / etc. lives in England. Come on. They were like, no. So I'm like, yeah, no, well, fuck it then.
Okay. Also with us, it's Guardian columnist Raphael Bear. Hi, Raph.
Hi there.
Raph, last week you wrote that the idea that Britain is at heart a Tory country has rubbed off on Labour, and I have been puzzling over this like a philosophy student. Do you disagree with the premise, or do you dislike the result, or a bit of both?
Well, I think we're at a fascinating point in British political history where really, for the first time ever, that is just simply no longer the case in a very fundamental way. So what I meant was that for most of my adult lifetime, there has this just been deep in the sort of cultural fabric of British politics is this sense that the Tories are kind of the default setting. And even when they lose, it's kind of the nation sort of on indulgence, but having a bit of a dabble with Labour government before basically going. And, when David Cameron came back after the long new Labour period, there was that sense of, oh, well, we're back again. We're sorry we disappeared for such a long time. Just like slipping power back on like a comfy pair of old slippers. It's so deep in the culture that Labour had sort of internalised that and get this kind of imposter syndrome. Even when they win, they feel, it's like it can't possibly last. And any minute now, we're going to get found out and chucked out again. And we have to win by trying to sort of be as much like the Tories as we can, which cephalogically is often true. And this election, it just feels that whole heuristic, that whole way of looking at the cultural sort of weft and warp of British politics does not apply. What's happening to the Tories now is something categorically new. And that's the point I was trying to make it in that paragraph. But as you can hear from how long it took me to explain it there, doesn't really, 7 words don't really do it justice.
I thought you explained it beautifully. And finally, joining us once more is Politics Joe's Ava Santina. Hello and welcome back, Ava.
Hello.
Ava, you've been getting a bit of intel from Corbyn's campaign as an independent against Labour's Praful Nargund in Islington North, where we are at the moment. What are you hearing?
Well, there's actually some upset today because both the Conservative and Labour candidates have decided that they are not going to attend the health hustings that were meant to take place this week in Islington North. And the independent candidate Jeremy Corbyn and his campaign were very much looking forward to that because they were hoping to show up Praffel, who is the Labour candidate, for Wes Streeting, the Shadow Health Secretary's policy on privatising the NHS. So they're very, very upset about it today.
Is that the thing now that we definitely Wes Streeting is privatising the NHS?
Sorry, do you know what? I sort of smashed that all together, didn't I?
I mean, I think it's very much their argument.
Sorry, his desire to use the private healthcare system to smash through the waiting list. Sorry, I should have been clearer. But so there was some upset actually a couple of days ago because the polling actually, I did have a look at it, but that came from the Corbyn campaign, and we'll get into this later, but the methodology was a little bit loose, but it seemed to suggest that Corbyn and the Labour candidate were about on par. And so the Corbyn campaign were out and about really pushing for campaigners to take on Islington North. But the problem is that what they're worried about is that people don't realise that Jeremy Corbyn is not the Labour candidate. Because I know that it might seem obvious if you are in the Westminster bubble or if you're really engaged in politics. But, there is potential for the average Joe that you don't realise.
It's a very recognisable name. He's been their MP for yonks. It would make complete sense to me. Do you think it's become a bit of a microcosm of sort of the wider fight by the left of Labour not to be completely shut out of power and extinguished, basically?
I actually think that Jeremy Corbyn's case is very different from what we've seen elsewhere. So Faiza Shaheen in Chingford and Diane Abbott in Hackney. I think that was, an open shut case of Starmer trying to rid the Labour Party of socialists. But with Jeremy Corbyn, I actually think that is more about Starmer removing the previous leader and the sort of the lefties that I suppose he came to represent that Starmer is now not keen on. I actually think that they're two different, completely different arguments.
Yeah. Right, before we start, a reminder about our live election night show at the Tabernacle in West London. The show is sold out, but you can join us on Zoom for free when you back us on Patreon. Ros, Dorian and I will be joined by friend of the pod, James O'Brien, to celebrate an absolute trouncing for the Conservatives, we hope. And Matt Green, to a Greek, this feels like massive hubris, but I'll plough on. Matt Green will be bringing his close personal friend, the Right Honourable Jeff Jeffrey, to explain why the results are actually very good news for the Conservative Party and for Rishi Sunak in particular. Search Patreon, Oh God What Now, or follow the link in the show notes, sign up, and we'll show you how to register for the Zoom. Then simply get the snacks and drinks in. It's going to be a beautiful night, isn't it? Isn't it? Well, we have now seen everyone's election manifestos, or I should say everyone's election manifesto and reforms contract, quite appropriately for a party that is actually a limited company. They signed it, so it's binding. We shall try to resist spending the next 20 minutes talking about how batshit the reform stuff is, because to do even that, I think would give it a level of credibility it has done nothing to deserve. Instead, last week, we looked at what the Tories had to offer, so it's only fair we hold Labour's plan to the same level of scrutiny. What is in it? What is not in it? Is Starmer the socialist Tories claim, the Tory socialists claim, or the disappointing children's magician that Beth Rigby claims? Raf, the Labour manifesto appears to have miraculously confirmed everything that everyone, fan or critic, thought already about Starmer. What did you make of it?
Well, it's interesting. I think you're right that people have been able to project onto it whatever it was they already thought. And that's partly because there were no surprises in it. There was nothing new. And it is, I think, worth taking a step back and thinking if Labour hadn't sort of made any policy announcement or hadn't said anything in the preceding 6 to 12 months, would the reception of the manifesto have been more dramatic, or would people have thought, actually, this is surprisingly radical, or, oh no, this is actually incredibly small c conservative? I mean, and that sort of tension or that ambiguity, I think, is expressed basically by the fact that it's sort of achieving two quite different things at the same time. One of which is that just purely on the fiscal level, in terms of just the tax and the spend stuff, because the strategic decision was made not to by Rachel Reeves and by others at the top of the Labour Party to, broadly speaking, accept the fiscal constraints that Jeremy Hunt imposed on the Labour Party to avoid a trap of being seen as wanting to raise taxes for everyone or borrowing too much. All the whole kind of game of fiscal reassurance, which we're very familiar with by now. There just simply isn't that much money available for the Labour Party to make the kind of radical spending promises that most people understand when they think, is an incoming government going to do big stuff? Big stuff tends to mean like, are you going to build loads more hospitals? Are you going to just stuff costs money? And that it's a reasonable assumption for people to think, if there's not much spending in there, it can't be that dramatic. I actually think sort of beneath the surface of that, some of the language, some of the ideas contained in it speak to, at a subtle level, a really quite profound shift that's about to happen in British politics. And by that, I mean a kind of both a winning manifesto and one that explicitly repudiates the market as the main engine and the mechanism for driving growth and prosperity in the future. So that is basically... I mean, I'm not going to say, it's the end of the neoliberal consensus, and people can interpret that word variously. But it does feel to me, if you look at the language around, using activist government to effect change, that being done by a majority government means we are really at the end of a moment that started in 1979 in this country. That's a long arc of history that has now arrived at a different point. And I think that's been underappreciated because so much of it more generally was familiar and felt a bit boring.
Sunak has persisted with a sort of tax rise attack line. In fact, the entire Tory campaign seems anchored to that dubious figure, which is maybe actually why they defended it so fiercely, because it seems like all their literature, every ad is about that figure. Labour says it's simply not true. We've got the manifesto now. Do we have a definitive answer to that?
Well, it's one of the sort of dispiriting features of the campaign generally. I think everyone can agree that, all this fiscal debate is taking place within these fictional parameters. I mean, Labour, they've already admitted there are some tax rises in there. I mean, the most famous one is VAT on private school fees. That is a tax rise, So there are mechanisms there which will raise revenue, and those go to pay for some of the things that are in there, but none of them, what everyone also knows about fiscal policy generally, and this is also applies to smaller parties that make all kinds of promises. It applies to the Greens when they say they're going to raise loads of money from wealth taxes. The only thing that really gets you serious heft for purchasing stuff is the basic rate of income tax, VAT to an extent, capital gains, business rates. Those are the proper taxes, basically. And those are not going up. And as a result, except for the VAT on school fees thing. And so the basic rates aren't going up. And so that limits the purchasing power of a Labour manifesto. And it means that the Sunak attack is sort of fiddling around in the margins, but also by definition, it means that no one's talking about realistically recapitalising public services. And that's obviously the big gap in the Labour manifesto. It's an enormous gap in the Conservative manifesto. I mean, doesn't even feature in their campaign. But because the Sunak attack has been focused so monomaniacally on the idea that Labour will raise taxes, actually the impact of that is to really shut down the necessary conversation about funding public services.
Yeah, and meanwhile, from the right, Reform are going, hold my beer, on the tax rise front. Ava, what were your key takeaways, I guess, from the manifesto?
I mean, it is true to say that the Labour manifesto shows that the tax burden is going to be the largest that we've seen in quite some time. But the key takeaway is what Keir Starmer has been trying to hammer home for the past few months, which is that there'll be no tax rises on working people. So the tax that they're going after will not affect the average person. Yeah. So they're looking at private equity.
There's a message in that, isn't there? And I find it weird that it's not been picked up, because he keeps saying we're not going to raise taxes on working people. And to me, that delineates something with something around it. That is, we might raise taxes on rich people.
Yes. I mean, Beth Rigby got some of the way there during the leaders' debate last week because she was saying to Keir Starmer, like, it's fine. Do you want a wealth tax? It's not a dirty idea, Keir. Just tell us. And he didn't, definitively say yes or say no. And so I think that is actually probably quite a clear clue that actually he might go after some capital gains. But he is actually going after capital gains because he's going to cancel the loophole that allows private equity. The payments that private equity bosses receive, currently they only pay 28% tax on them, and he is going to raise that. It will probably be raised to around 40%.
To match, basically, the higher rate of income tax.
Yes, it was sort of to match, what everyone else is paying, just...
Outrageous, Starmer!
Yes. And then I guess the argument that he would make there is because that's sort of like capital gains. It's not really on working people. It's not technically, actual manual work. So we sort of got away with it there. But I thought, in terms of spending, in terms of the manifesto, I was actually totally fascinated by the National Wealth Fund. I can't believe this country doesn't have a sovereign wealth fund. I think it's a fantastic idea. The notion that you can encourage by, giving over £1 of public money, that'll be matched by £3 of private investment. And then out of the back of that, you can have wonderful wind turbines and lots of other fantastic public services. I just think it's an incredible idea, and I cannot believe we haven't done it before.
Yeah. My sister lives in Norway. Her family's there. And I can tell you the Sovereign Wealth Fund is just an amazing thing. It's basically like a pension plan and a yearly dividend and everything.
That Norwegian example, the Norwegian example is fascinating because obviously they've got a sort of sovereign wealth fund capitalised by North Sea hydrocarbon resources, but Britain had North Sea oil too, and the fact the squandering of the British North Sea oil bonanza, basically on conservative tax cuts through the 1980s, that have basically yielded. I mean, obviously people benefited from it at the time, and they drove growth, and lots of people bought nice stuff as a result of having money in the Lawson boom and the rest of it, but. It amazes me as part of the general narrative of British politics over the last 20 or 30 years that it is not more salient that we pissed our North Sea oil up the wall. Yeah. I find that astonishing compared to what the Norwegians...
A few years ago, they found some other reserves that they didn't know were there, and which basically suddenly boosted the wealth fund.
What does that mean?
It meant like £1.5 grand extra for everyone.
No. I'm just saying.
No. They found more fuel. They found more fuel reserves that they didn't know.
Just at any given time, they've got a guy tapping the soil. And guys, lands.
And they asked people, considering you didn't know this money was coming, do you want it, or shall we give it to? It was a particular African country that was having a massive sort of famine at the time, and like 70% of people went, no, you give it to them. We're okay. I just think, would that ever happen in this country? Like, ever?
But what I will say briefly, so like, to be fair to him, so Michael Peel, the FT journalist, his book, What Everyone Knows About Britain, which got published this year, which I read for a review, like, he makes that point about the North Sea oil in the Sovereign Wealth Fund. But also, I think I'd not realised that apparently quite a lot, like in quite a lot of other countries, people have been writing articles and papers on this for like ages, just going... Why did Britain not and that genuinely a subject of like international consternation, and there's like, I'm not even British and I feel vaguely ashamed, like just secondhand.
Ava, you've actually been out and about speaking to voters. Marie and Raf despise people.
That's true.
You're the
I'm not even going to rise to that.
I am joking, of course.
It's humanity I don't like. Individual people are fine.
Yes. So what are people saying to you, Ava? Do they even know the manifesto was sort of published? Do they know what's in it? Are they happy with it, unhappy with it?
I'm about to just drop like the worst possible answer to that, which is that no, actually not a lot of people realise that the manifesto had dropped. So the way that you go about that is you actually then start presenting parts of the manifesto. Yeah. You go, do you like this? Yeah. And what I think the Labour campaign are going to hate this, and actually a few of them have already texted me to tell me that they hate this. The £2,000 line from Rishi Sunak and the Conservatives has had the most extraordinary cut through. most people that I spoke to quoted that back to me. They said, well, I mean, I would quite like public services, and I would quite like to see an improvement in local availability of services, but I do not want to spend £2,000 extra a year, on tax.
Even though it's not a year.
Yeah. And then I would say, well, it's actually not quite true. And they would go, well, I don't know. The maths does, it's got to come from somewhere. It's just had the most extraordinary cut through. Apart from that, the £28 billion green plan, people are still talking about that. And it's actually very difficult because it turns into a point where I'm actually now acting like a Labour advisor or Labour canvasser on the street. And I'm like, well, what they've actually got now is they're going to invest £1.7 billion in wind turbines. Mm-hmm. Do you like that? Do you like that? And I just,
Do you want a wind turbine?
That is so depressing, man. Marie, is there any point to manifestos at all? I mean, haven't the last 5 years shown that any plan is overtaken by events the moment a new PM basically sets foot in number 10?
Well, Alex, there is a world in which I would have had actually a very long and very interesting answer to this, because I pitched a research paper to some think tanks on literally exactly this a few years ago.
Oh, right.
And no one picked up the idea. Like, apparently I'm too wonky for the wonks.
Oh, I would be interested.
If you would like to pay for my paper, Alex, then I'd be delighted.
I'm not sure I'd pay for it, mate.
Oh, fine. Yeah.
I'd read it.
Oh, well, thank you. I'll add that to the email. Alexandra would read it. But no, more seriously, I mean, there's not... It sort of depends. I think manifestos are quite interesting in that it is worth remembering that in 2017, the dementia tax, the Theresa May kind of, beginning of the end, came out of that. So I think things can start going very wrong after a manifesto is released. So in that sense, they do matter. I think the other, perhaps, quite wonky point to make is that the Salisbury Convention still matters in that, we see the Lords can't vote against stuff that was in a governing party's manifesto. The Lords are actually, are still going to be a very Tory place, especially for the first few years until Keir Starmer makes more appointments. So actually, in that sense, it is quite relevant for Labour to try and put everything they can in the manifesto, because then the Lords will not be able to do anything about it. But yeah, aside from that,
The IFS's position, in summary, I think it's fair to say, is that basically no party will survive just leaving public services to their current trajectory. So anyone elected will have to do something about that stuff, which means they'll have to raise money from somewhere. And all the polling shows that voters know that. So why are we dancing this dance where everyone pretends they're not going to put taxes up?
Yeah, and I agree, although I agree that the £2,000 Conservative attack line has had cut through. I've been struck speaking to people also that at some level the recognition that taxes are going up anyway, things have got to be paid for. I've heard that as well. Just sort of vox pops are appallingly unscientific as a measure of public opinion.
All right.
but we all do them because they are also. The second part of that is they are also weirdly extraordinarily effective sometimes in just giving you a very good sense of what's going on. I mean, every by-election I've covered, somehow an unscientific sample of vox pops gives you quite an accurate sense of what's going to happen. And I've been struck by enough people saying, look, ultimately stuff needs fixing. Tax is how that happens. That is out there too.
Well, do you know what Nigel Farage said today? Not to jump the gun, but he did say that he's the only politician who's bold enough to admit that the money has run out. I just thought that was extraordinary because he's not. That's all we've heard.
Yeah, he's promising loads of stuff.
Yeah, but all we've heard is that we've got to spend more, or we've got to tax more, or we've got to find money reallocated in some sense, some vague way. I don't know why he thought that was an original thought this afternoon.
I resent the entire way in which this thing is discussed. You see, this is like a running bugbear for me because, it's not an allowance. You're not basically deciding how you're going to spend the fiver in your pocket. You have to decide what it is you need, how much will it cost, and then how you fund it. You can't go the opposite way.
But I think that's the legacy of Cameron and Osborne, the kind of proper household budget stuff. I think that is very much the 2010 Cameron and Osborne. They're the ones who broke everything for everyone.
So we will naturally then reach a point where people will go, police can't afford that.
There was an appalling and ludicrous and typically vacuous Rishi Sunak tweet, actually, or whatever the word is now, because it's X, saying, the I can't remember the exact wording, but basically ordinary people will always know how to spend their own money better than the government. I think, well, yes, except ordinary people, I'm not going to save up for an army or a hospital. That they literally the function of general taxation. Yeah, well, okay, I could try. It would take me a long time. But it just
selfish prick. I'm saving every day. Are you?
But the extraordinary
no, like
sort of
not like for
failure.
your army though. I think that's what Raf is
my
saying.
own private army. Yeah,
Oh, she's gone a bit Game of Thrones, Raf. I'm sorry.
It is interesting that, at a very fundamental level, the inability of anyone to articulate the function of taxation as pooling of resources to get economies of scale to buy nice stuff for everyone. Keir Starmer very briefly had a go at this in his most recent party conference speech, where he talked about, he may use the metaphor of tax fund as crowdfunding. It's like taxation is basically like history's best ever form of crowdfunding. I thought that's a good line, but clearly they just decided that there was just no point even trying to make that argument. That was the only time I've heard a leader of a party just even try and articulate the positive case for what taxes are actually for.
No, to come back to the question briefly, I was actually going to shamelessly steal a tweet from a former Lib Dem advisor, because I think he put it very well and very succinctly. So he posted yesterday, Sean Kemp, saying, British politics is 4 years of people asking, why don't we have the vision to make difficult decisions in this country? Then 6 weeks of demanding that political parties rule out making any difficult decisions.
That's fair.
That's basically it.
That's fair. That's true. The Labour are basically being treated as the incumbent party. Is that fair enough given their poll lead, Marie, or does it actually skew a process of accountability that should be part of this election record? Part of us making this decision should be assessing how the last people did compared to the promises they made when they got elected.
So I think it's a bit of a tough one, because on the one hand, I can see the reasoning for saying actually there's only, for example, so much space in a newspaper, so many political journalists analysing stuff, and we really want to focus on what will actually happen, because let's be honest, there will not be a Conservative majority government after the 4th of July. But on the other hand, I do think that part of it is slightly, I'm going to sound like the canary here, but it is just that the press in Britain isn't actually right-leaning, because actually even when Jeremy Corbyn was polling appallingly, the Labour would put out a policy and, the papers would kind of go like, oh, well, we've tried to cost it and, it's not costed and, how would they pay for it, etc., even when, again, there was no chance in hell that Labour would ever win. So I think part of it is reasonable, part of it is just the kind of natural anti-Labour bias in the press.
I think that's a fair point. I hadn't thought of that.
It's
Corbyn
tricky.
Was scrutinised in the same sort of way as if everything he did had to be costed, but anything coming from the other side was just accepted on faith. Sorry, you were saying, Raf?
Yeah, I just think there's a tricky balance, isn't there? Because I intuitively it annoys me basically that there is this sort of preemption of the result that means you treat Labour as if they have some incumbency to defend, which is ludicrous. We had 14 years of Conservative government. But if you don't factor in the reality of who is likely to be the next government, that also leads to a place where you think, well, let's consider all the manifestos and all the propositions with equal validity. And, that would be a good thing in a sense if it meant that the Reform Manifesto was subject to the same sort of scrutiny, or the Greens for that matter. But also, they are simply not going to form a government, and there is an element of absurdity there. It's difficult if you can't simultaneously think, why does Nigel Farage get so much attention? He's actually a fringe candidate, and it's just the media inflating him out of nowhere. But also, why aren't everyone treating all these manifestos as if they can be subject to equivalent levels of scrutiny? Those two things slightly rub against each other.
Yes, okay, Raf, but isn't that basically to introduce the Brexit style campaigning for anyone that's behind in the polls? We saw Reform today launch their contract with the people, or as I like to think of it, putting out a contract on the people. And they're basically promising the moon and the stars for no extra money. I mean, if you look at where the money's coming in, they just go, we're going to save £5 for every 100 that is spent on public services. And it's like, how will you do that? It's the underpants gnomes.
I mean, it's insane. I mean, they do have some costings, and they're just absolutely made up. I'm looking at some of them now. They've got, they're going to raise £30 billion from scrapping net zero targets, 50 billion from getting rid of quangos and commissions. I mean, you could just make these numbers up. The interesting thing about the reform dynamic, though, is that's actually an expression, I think, of something else, which is that there are two separate elections going on here. There's one which Labour are winning, and as a result are going to form the next government. And then there's this other weird one where the Conservatives and Reform are basically battling over the same subset of the electorate. And as a result, I mean, given that reform, the Conservatives' main rival in this election now for the voters who are up for grabs is Reform. So the Conservative to Labour switchers, there's about 1.7 million of them since 2020, but they're not switching back. Like, they're pretty locked in for Labour. And although existentially the Conservative Party needs to understand why all those people have left the Conservative Party to go to a party to the left of the Conservatives, they've convinced themselves that strategically they have to stop more people bleeding over to Reform. They have to win people back from Reform. But they're not actually taking the argument to Reform. So I just saw the press release from the Conservative Party's response to the Reform manifesto launch, and it said, basically, breaking Conservative response to Reform manifesto launch, and an immediate attack on the Labour Party, and this will just let Labour in, and a load of stuff on those Labour tax rises that they've made up. They are incapable of articulating either a practical or a principled reason why you shouldn't vote for Reform on the basis of what Reform are saying. And that's because it's so like what the Conservatives have been saying and doing. They can't say, you can't possibly trust Nigel Farage. He's the idiot that gave us Brexit. I mean, that would be a very compelling argument for a bunch of people, but unfortunately not one the Conservative Party can make. They can't say, don't trust Nigel Farage. He's basically mates with Liz Truss. It's, his economic prospectus is like Trussism on steroids, because, well, guess what? Which party was Liz Truss from? So they are absolutely screwed. But that's the one place where you would need someone to really come along and actually attack the Reform agenda on its own terms. And they can't do it.
Ava, we've also seen the Tories switch to a sort of please don't hurt us too much campaign message, basically going on about super majorities, effectively conceding defeat and warning that if Labour get a very big majority, they will do loads of socialist stuff. What are the risks with that approach?
I guess it kind of has the potential to, say, if you started revealing the postal votes on ballot day, and then you might demobilise people. People might decide, oh, well, there's already a foregone conclusion. There's no point in me getting out of bed today to go and vote. And perhaps that might benefit the Conservatives in some way, because some people who were planning to switch to Labour, or maybe some Labour voters, won't actually won't bother. If I was going to be really sneaky about this, what I would do as a Conservative strategist is I would start going for the Labour left covertly. So I would start making the argument, instead of the line that you hear out of the Conservatives is Keir Starmer is a dangerous socialist and he's going to tax you loads. If they started telling the Labour left, the typical people who actually vote for Labour, that Keir Starmer is not going to help you at all and he's going to make you poorer and he's going to forget about working people and he only wants to get money off of businesses to fund his big party empire, perhaps that would be a good way to siphon off votes, because I just
to reform.
Well, no, but just to get people to stay at home.
Yeah, I guess so.
To get people to not turn up to vote. The traditional Labour voters, just to de-incentivise them, because at the moment, trying to hammer home this line that Keir Starmer is a dangerous socialist is not having any cut through.
Yeah, it was kind of part of Trump's strategy in 2016, a little bit, this idea that Hillary Clinton was part of the establishment. She's not going to do anything for you. And it did actually depress the...
It was a very significant part of that Trump victory.
Yeah. So I think that's interesting. Let's hope they're not listening. Marie Sunak...
Who's that again? Yeah.
Notably absent again in the last few days. I mean, what is going on? I've seen like stills of him. Is he still alive?
Not even holding the day's newspaper, so no idea when they were taken. Yeah. I feel like over the past few weeks, whenever he stepped outside number 10, he's just stepped directly onto a rake, then another rake, then another rake. So I feel like, if I were him, I would also just not leave my bed. So I'm not sure. I can't pretend I have any insights into why he's not been especially present over the past few days. I'm going to guess, and again, this is me being a bit bitchy, but also that's a genuine thing. He's probably yet again in a room with his advisors going, well, The last 7 approaches have failed. Do we have another idea? And after which they will come out again for like 2 to 3 business days and then go, no, that didn't work either.
Yep.
3 days back in the bunker and so on.
Have we considered what he told us last week, that he eats a lot of Haribo and a lot of other sweets, and perhaps he's just had a sugar crash?
He's in a carb coma.
Yeah.
Right, next up, time to choose our hero and villain of the week. Who is this week's Bo Lucy and who is Surrey Police? Raf, let's start with you.
So I'll go villain first. My villains of the week, or if you want to break it down to individuals, is anyone in the stadium of the England fans who booed the Serbian national anthem in the football. I can't stand that. And, as someone who grew up, in the 1980s, half of that decade where England were banned from European football, who's just lived through just the England fans just disgracing themselves, revealing this very visceral, deep, extraordinary capacity for barbarism as soon as they go abroad, and just take a moment to feel relieved that generally is no longer such a thing. You don't have to you can actually enjoy supporting the England team because you don't have to feel deeply ashamed of the fans. Any reminder of what that shame felt like, I just really makes my blood run cold.
And your hero?
And my hero is, I'm going to say, Evan Gershkovich, the Wall Street Journal reporter who is currently in a Russian high security prison, which is not a nice place to be. And his trial is up next week. And I always feel we need to sort of flag the fact that it's just an extraordinary thing that happened. The Russian state taking a journalist hostage. We're journalists. We like to try and find out what's going on. Luckily, we live in a country where we're not going to basically be put in a high security prison for doing our job. And as far as I can tell, he has withstood that with extraordinary fortitude. And that in and of itself, first of all, to remind people that he's there, and also as a mark of respect for the fact that he's still going.
Okay. How about you, Ava?
No, don't make me follow that one.
No, please.
Mine are also very frivolous. So
he does this. He does this every fucking week, right?
Okay.
He comes up with really serious ones that are very difficult to answer, and I'm not going to give him either. So
Okay.
it's a free. No, I might. I haven't decided
this is awful.
yet.
And I have to open with some French, so that's even worse. How do you say this, Marie? Fed le Grand.
What?
Oh,
Show me on the phone.
It says after hero. Do you see that?
Oh, Fede le Grand, I think.
Yeah, that
to be
one.
fair, that's not Fede is not Fed like that. I've never encountered that.
Well,
French
do you
name.
know, if you hadn't been here, I'd have just gone Cockney with it, and then we would have breezed past. Anyway, they're my hero because of their 2006 hit, Let Me Think About It.
Okay.
Specifically because that paved the way for the worst TikTok video I have ever seen in my life, which is Suella Braverman strutting in her constituency while these sort of I guess they're canvassers, but it's so upsetting to look at. They're sort of jumping out and attempting to dance. It's the most dismal setting and the most dismal performance I have seen.
So who's your villain of the week then?
Oh, my villain is my villain. Not for the reasons that you might expect, but is the protester who leapt up during the Labour manifesto launch. And the reason that she's my villain, she's from the Green New Deal, the reason she's my villain is because I couldn't hear her. And I think if you are going to make a protest and you are going to disrupt a manifesto launch, then please make it clear why you're protesting and hold a sign that the rest of us can actually read.
Project, God damn it. Okay, how about you, Marie?
So my hero, and I'm probably going to butcher the name, and I'm very sorry. So there you go, Ava, and we're all
Great.
Is Jovan Owusu-Nepal, who's the Labour candidate in Clacton, who is, as far as I can tell, the only parliamentary candidate in this election who actually dresses incredibly well. And it's not just the clothes, but the way he wears them as well, the way he kind of walks around. Like a genuinely, sincerely stylish candidate who you can tell really loves clothes. And as someone who, I love clothes, and also I work in politics, and my life is very sad so much of the time. So I was really happy.
He really does look, like he's on a one-man mission to inject some style into this drab campaign, right?
Exactly. And my villain is Éric Ciotti, the former president of the Republicans in France, because obviously, Macron called the snap election. He was the leader of the Republicans, the traditional right party. And then very early on, he said that the party would be open to making a coalition with the Rassemblement National, with Marine Le Pen's party, which was, absolutely infuriating, but it definitely descended into a farce after a while, because it turned out that he'd not told anyone in the party that he was going to mention that in the press. So the party went mental, understandably, and so the next day they were going to have this big meeting at the party HQ.
He locked himself in his office.
He locked himself in the he locked himself in his office, and then he just locked the doors to the HQ, so the bigwigs could not have a meeting.
I've never had anything more ludicrous. I was reading that report and I was crying with laughter. What is the final thing you can do to keep control of the party? Just lock the door. Just don't let them in.
Did you see that video? I think the point at which I really lost it and started weeping with laughter as well is that quite shaky footage of him at the balcony, with on the first floor by the windows, kind of flailing a bit. Obviously, he's no longer president, but slightly more seriously, I think I worry that he opened the doors very, very early on, because we've now seen quite a few traditional right-wing politicians in France saying, actually, maybe we should make a deal. So weird man, but also poisonous man.
This is not easy, actually. I think I'll have to give villain to the England fans booing the Serbian anthem, just because it really does chime with me. I just bury my head in my hands and I think, why are you doing this? Just.
Why don't you get it?
It's not your moment.
I find it quite funny,
it's someone else's turn now. Just let it go.
We've got a fun gender dynamic here, because I think both Ava and I find it quite funny.
Yeah, we're quite pro.
Yeah, so I don't like proper fighting in the stands.
Yeah, it's not a vote, is it? It's not a vote, is it?
That is true.
You give your recommendations, I'm deciding. Okay?
What about the nudity?
Do either of you want nothing this week?
No,
is that what you want?
Fine, I'll be quiet.
Okay. And then I'm going to give hero jointly to Jovan Uvusune-Paul, because I do find his one-man campaign to kind of just inject fashion.
Yeah, raise the sartorial standard.
Yeah,
and
jointly with Éric Ciotti, actually, who I'm going to declare a joint hero of the week, just because I think if I were on the very last stages of losing power and holding on by my fingernails, I would like to behave with that little grace. I fully see myself as the person kind of locking the door, going out on the balcony, going, shoo now, shoo. It's my party.
I'm sorry to say I can see it, Alex.
Next up, are we over-polling this election? Friends of the podcast Best for Britain released their giant tactical voting guide on getvoting.org today, based on an MRP megapoll. But is so much polling actually helpful? Does it empower voters or reduce them to spectators of something already happening independently of them? It's a simple question, but one with significant implications. The accusation has long been that opinion polling is there to influence rather than merely reflect. How do we know what polls to trust, or how they even work? Ava, there are so many polling companies now out there. How do you know which one to trust? What do you look for?
I have to say, the first thing I look for is that it's not been done by a broadcaster. If it's been done by a broadcaster, I normally just
shunted it a little bit.
Yeah, I normally, you step away. I mean, that can be interesting if you then want to go even further and see what are the normal demographic for who engages with that broadcaster. Then it could be interesting. I actually like to look at the question that's being asked, because I think that the tone of the question, the phrase of the question, can massively influence the outcome. Just a little move around, like, would you vote for reform? Yes. Are you going to vote for reform? No. The two different questions there, I suppose they're the same in essence, but actually they would produce a completely different outcome. On the polling, though, I do think, I know we're going to talk about this more, but it is totally mad how many polls are being conducted. I mean, I actually think that this might be because newspapers and outlets are so desperate for clicks, and they have realised that polling, and especially like outlandish polling like the YouGov poll we saw last week that put Reform ahead of the Conservatives.
Tiny sample.
Tiny sample, and has fielded, excessive attention. It's all that Nigel Farage has now spoken about, and therefore all we've spoken about ever since. But, I think that perhaps this might be the clickbait culture that we're all sort of plugging into.
Yeah. As someone who used commission polls, I can also say that what you don't see are the softening up questions that are asked before the main question.
Right.
Because they're not part of the result that you get. And they can genuinely really affect the answer you get. Like if you go to people and you ask, do you think that, people who rape children should get the death penalty, and that kind of question, 2 or 3 of those, and then you ask them about who they plan to vote, you can really, really affect the answer you get back.
There's a famous Yes Minister scene where exactly this happens. They run through the different ways you can get people to say yes or no to whether they would support keeping the nuclear deterrent. And one polling company actually tested exactly that script in a real poll and found exactly the result that the Yes Minister script writers anticipated.
It doesn't surprise me. I mean, it's what you do when you commission polls. You have a result that you kind of want in your head because it's more newsworthy, or because, there would have been a race like for the first company to say that Reform are now ahead of the Tories, because they would have known it would get massive attention. So within the margin of error, if you can massage the figures a tiny bit, I'm not saying YouGov did that, but I'm saying there would have been every incentive when you weigh samples and normalize everything. There would have been every incentive if you're between saying the level pegging, or you could equally easily say Reform is ahead. What are you going to say as a pollster? I mean, obviously you're going to say they're a point ahead.
Do you think that there's potential here with Labour? Okay, listen, this is ridiculous.
Yeah, I'm ready. Go on.
Is there potential that, Labour have been steadfast ahead in the polls, that the people who are answering the questions, that are pulling out, this huge result for Labour every single time, do you think they actually are going to vote that way? Or do you think that perhaps it's the human condition and they are just ticking what they think is the correct answer? Because they've been conditioned to think now for a good year.
Strong horse theory.
Labour...
We're going to talk about that.
Oh, sorry.
There's a name for it.
Yeah.
No, I'm saying it's completely valid and there's a name for it. Raf, do you think more than ever polls have an agenda-setting role rather than just providing a snapshot?
Certainly this election, it feels that it's overpolled and that the polling has informed the narrative. And I think that in a couple of ways, I mean, just, if there is this massive lead, and it does look like Labour have, it's hard for them to lose now, that sort of necessarily shapes the way people behave. It could encourage Labour supporters, in Bristol or Brighton to vote Green because there's no danger of accidentally allowing the Tories in. So it can necessarily actually literally affect voting choices, if you think the result is already determined, which of course it never is. But also I think there's another element, where it becomes a sort of a feedback loop, which is if you get a polling that suggests that not much is changing, there is such an appetite for in political reporting that you need to find some other way of constructing a conventional conflict race dynamic, which is why the Reform Conservative thing is getting disproportionate attention. I mean, it's incredibly interesting. If you think let's say that the polling is absolutely right, or the broad thrust of the polling is right, and that what actually happens is Labour win with a massive majority, also lots of Lib Dems, and the Tories are really very badly decimated. What that will actually say is that, broadly speaking, the alignment of the country, like the country politically, the hue of opinion and who we are, is very, very different to a lot of the presumptions of what people have said it is since 2016, right? It will be an enormously significant cultural moment. Now, interesting political reporting might be to go, well, how did that happen? Who are these people? Who are the sort of the 38-year-old mortgage holding, ex-Remain voting but Surrey living person who's switched from Tory to Labour? Those are interesting questions. But our political reporting is so not set up for that. Our political reporting is set up for the horse race, for the jeopardy. And so because Labour-Tory is not a jeopardy story, suddenly we start talking about something else. So in that sense, it creates these weird feedback loops, which then are iterative, and we end up, it is clearly impacting what will actually happen.
I mean, the thing that popped into my head while you were saying that was you're a sports reporter covering the last 5-6 weeks of the Premier League, and the top team is 20 points ahead. And so you immediately switch to the battle for second place. If you have 3 teams that are level pegging, that becomes your interesting thing, as it were. Marie, so the flip side of that notion is the strong horse theory, which suggests that when voters spot a clear winner, they tend to back it because everyone likes to back a winner. Are we seeing any evidence of that? Or does the sort of British penchant for the underdog actually cut across this theory and means that we might see an anomaly where people think, because that's kind of the appeal at the moment from the Conservatives, right? Don't give them a supermajority.
Yes, I really enjoy the theory, actually, that very, very early on when Rishi Sunak decided to call the election without an umbrella in pouring rain, he was actually trying to give the sympathy vote of just going, like, I'm just a little boy. I'm just like, oh, come on. But no, more seriously, so I'm tempted to slightly reject the premise in that I'm sure that there's something about the strong horse theory and people like being on the winning side. And I think, anecdotally, that's something you see a lot of in leadership contests. So I think a lot of MPs, like whoever ends up becoming leader, people will be like, oh, well, so many of the MPs supported them. Usually what happens is that a certain number of MPs supported them, and then the other MPs went, ooh, that looks like someone who's going to win and may be able to give me a job. So I think, that definitely works, I think, in Parliament. I'm not convinced, I think, for the voters at large, purely because most of them just really, really do not follow politics or care about it at all. So I think, actually, I'm not convinced that so many of them follow politics closely enough that, you would see that as an effect that would actively properly show up in the data. So, yes, so it may exist a bit, but I'm not convinced it's a massive thing, purely because, again, we live in a really small bubble of weird nerds. But yeah, I think it's interesting in that, looking at the broader picture and the kind of longer term trends, it is mad that, Reform and the Conservatives are kind of level pegging. I think just in terms of the micro campaign stuff, it's not that interesting that they've gone from like maybe 2 points below to 1 point above. Like, fine, it's symbolic, but also who cares? And again, all within the margin of error. But also given FPCP, that they will not, like, Reform will not win many seats anyway. So no, again, I'm weirdly struggling to get exercised about it. Like, again, if a few years ago you told the Conservatives, oh yeah, by the way, quick thing, there's going to be a point at which you're polling at exactly the same level as Reform UK, then that would have been shocking. But right now, I'm not especially.
And there's also a little bit of Ghidorah versus Mecha Godzilla thing where you think, fuck them, let them kill each other. What do I care?
Well, so Farage has something interesting to say about this, which is that so when the poll came out, he said this should now be reflected in my broadcasting opportunities. So I should be, the BBC and the other big broadcasters should take note, and I should be put on a stage, the same number of times that the Conservatives are, because I am one of the large parties now. What's interesting about that to me is we should now continue to poll Reform for the rest of time, and his broadcast appearances should only correlate to the poll.
When they're back on 5%, basically.
Yes, so if Reform dissolves, if the business dissolves and there's 0%...
No, listen, it was very, very interesting that because he was on Question Time 3 weeks ago, just before he announced that he was taking over Reform. And the BBC got loads of complaints about that, and they went, well, he's a very prominent person in politics and he was an MEP for 20 years. And then he announced he was taking over Reform. So he was on Question Time, the 7 leader thing, the week after. And now he wants so basically he wants to be on Question Time every single week. Raf, is there a danger that this abundance of data can make both politicians and journalists quite lazy, like give the impression that one can glean how the election is going just by looking at numbers and completely miss what the vibe out there is?
Well, yeah, it comes back to a little bit what we were discussing earlier about the vox pop, which is simultaneously bad data. I mean, it's sort of, you're not catching a representative sample. We've all done it. We all know that first of all, what happens is, if you go on a weekday, the group of people that you find, outside supermarket on a Saturday lunchtime in the high street is not going to give you a good demographic sample of actually the balance of people in the constituency. So the old-fashioned journalistic way of just sort of sampling public opinion was sort of scientifically inferior to a massive MRP poll that with a sample of 100,000. So clearly that at that level, the polling is better information. And yet, I think there is something I'm loath to sort of reject the value of gut and vibe in election campaigns and in politics. And certainly there have been times when, I remember very clearly in the 2015 general election, when right up here for most of the last year of that parliament and right into the campaign, there was strong evidence that it could be a hung parliament. I had lots of Tory MPs who were saying, we've looked at the seats, we've looked at the way it falls down. We're just, Ed Miliband's going to be the prime minister. We can't stop it, or it's going to be really, really close. And yet just everywhere you went, you heard from people who said, the sound of Ed Miliband's voice makes me want to kind of slam my own head in a car door. He did in his own brother. And you just think, this country will not make that man prime minister. I don't care what the numbers say. That's just, I've lived here. I know it's not going to happen. And the people who went with their gut on that were right. And the people who were overly hooked on the data sort of needlessly hedged that view. And so, I don't know. My sense now is we're in a weird situation where, going back to actually your question right at the very beginning about this sort of, is this ultimately a Tory country? It is so hard to shake off the sense that somehow on the day Tory voters crawl out of the woodwork, that there's just this thing that happens, that whatever else goes on, deep down, there's just an awful lot of people who are just going to turn up and vote Conservative on the 4th of July. And the data are telling you, no, that's broken. That is no longer a thing that happens. And it'll be genuinely, I think our instruments are unreliable. And that's what makes it fascinating. But that's also why I just want to fast forward to that day. I can't really stand 2 more weeks of just waiting.
Raphael Bear there, listeners, shitting on epistemology as a whole. Data is rubbish. Let's go.
We love data. I bow to the gods of data, but I also pay tribute to the intuition of expertise.
The only point I would make is that the two are not mutually exclusive.
Exactly.
That if there's a laziness that creeps into people who think they can glean the election just from looking at the data, that's their, bad. But an abundance of data, surely you can take it or leave it. It's there to inform. And if you look at proxies, I think they're better than, because I've done a little bit of work behind the scenes on that big MRP poll. And if you look at proxies, they can be actually more accurate than the question, are you planning to vote for X or who are you planning to vote for? Like, if you look at the Brexit data, the closest proxy was people's view on the death penalty. That was like the thing that would have predicted entirely accurate how that result would go.
Which way did it go? Remain as the pro-death penalty, I assume.
No, the other.
A younger person with an axe, yeah.
Yeah, so what MRP does is it basically mixes those two things. It says, this is the data, but now we've looked at basically the demographics of a particular seat and what people believe on other stuff, like what takeaway they prefer, all of that little stuff where people tend to answer more honestly, and actually they reflect their political views many times more accurately.
No, this is really piqued my interest.
Yeah.
So what takeaway would lead to, I don't know, wanting Priti Patel to lead the Conservative Party?
There's a whole thing. We'll drop a link in the notes. Seriously. There's a whole thing of research.
Look, I'm really more of a vibes-based journalist.
No,
so if you could just explain it to me very quickly.
So generally speaking, Labour are Chinese, okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, generally speaking.
Really?
And Tories, I think, are pizza. But yeah, I know, surprising, isn't it?
No way.
Yeah. So we'll drop a link, and you don't have to have a look at it, but listeners can.
Marie can voice note me.
Fine.
How much attention do you think candidates, parties, politicians pay to polls, especially polls that focus on sort of issues? To what extent do they frame their strategic offering around what they think is popular. And so the extension to that is, has polling basically supplanted moral leadership in a way?
God, I mean, I feel like that's probably a question you maybe could have asked in like at any point since '97, right? I think like focus
Well,
groups
I'm asking
and like
you today.
So yeah, well, I mean, it's good that you did not ask it in '97 because I was a child, Alex. But no, I don't think that's necessarily a new phenomenon for kind of parties to really use focus groups and use very, very kind of specific bits of polling. But yes, as you mentioned, I think. Then I don't believe that the parties are necessarily really looking at every day going, oh, well, the kind of national overall data and the kind of voting intentions, how that's changing, because that's not that helpful. And in any case, that's not going to massively, I think, change the campaign unless, again, there's some dramatic changes. But, on the smaller stuff that they do, I think they do clearly use it. I don't know, it's a slightly weird question. So I'm not convinced there was ever a time when parties would only, like the only things they would put in their manifesto were the things they knew to be right and true and correct and good for the country. Like, I'm too cynical to believe that was ever a thing. I think that, that the technology is better now, but I'm sure that even at the time they were probably trying to guess what, saying, well, these bits of the country didn't vote for us last time. What do we reckon they'd want? And then, and we'll chuck that in. So yes, I do think they do that, but I'm not convinced that's kind of a new thing necessarily.
Okay, so let's ignore all the data and each of you, your gut. What's your gut telling you will happen? Ignore everything in the polls. Raf, I'm going to begin with you since you opened this can of awful worms.
Well, the thing is, it's so hard.
No.
I'm just gonna say,
there's no getting out. You have to.
Not disaggregating my judgment from the data. Okay, I'll tell you my gut, and I'll do because everyone's got the kind of, and MPs have this too, the little one person kind of focus group. Like, I remember like one Conservative cabinet minister telling me it was like his gardener. People who just like, there's always the person or the hairdresser, this person who you feel has some almost sacred capacity to tell you, or some emblem, right? For me, this is what I found, right? I've driven across rural Sussex a few times in the last days where there's some hardcore, solid Tory voting parts of the country there. Like, just literally, you could run a donkey with a blue rosette and you'd get a Tory MP in some of these parts of the world. And I have not seen a single Tory placard or met a single person who will say they're going to vote Conservative. So I think the Tories are well and truly up for an absolutely horrific, blood-inducing spanking.
Okay.
Well,
how about
that
you, Mary?
was vivid as an image. Yeah.
How about you?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure. I think I'm now weirdly, cause I don't even like being contrarian, but I think I'm slightly team is going to be a slightly smaller, majority than expected. By which I still mean probably bigger than 97, but not quite, only like 16 Tory MPs left, etc. And that's and the media suddenly going to go, well, disappointing night for Keir Starmer and the Labour Party. Only a majority of 160. So I think big majority, but perhaps not as big as we're seeing in the polls right now.
Ava, your gut.
I think the Tories will hemorrhage seats, but I think that the big story will be in a couple of months' time, because I think Nigel Farage will win his seat in Clacton, and I do think that he will make a move to the Conservative Party. I think that he will cross the floor when he is an MP and attempt to remodel the party in his name. And then that's really when the entire party will combust.
Very interesting.
Or cease to exist.
I guess I should give mine just to be fair to I think it's going to be a smaller majority than most people anticipate. And I think actually it's the Liberal Democrats that would do a lot better than people think.
Ed Davey.
It just feels like there's a whole bunch of seats where people really want to give the Conservatives a spanking and feel much more comfortable voting for Ed Davey's party, and I think they will be the surprise of their evening. But I think Labour will still have a
As the on the Lib Dem thing, like talking about kind of like focus groups of one. I think a friend of Ava and I's actually, he was very much a right wing voter, but messaged me out of nowhere a couple of weeks ago to say, Marie, I think I'd shag Ed Davey. And if that's not a sign that Lib Dems are going to do very well, then you know.
And on that bombshell, we've reached the end of the show.
Did we learn nothing from Cleggmania, by the way? Can I just say?
Plainly not. So it's time for escape routes. What has been the soothing compress that has cooled our brow, feverish from the election virus? And please don't all say the Euros.
2 quick things. The first thing is Hacks season 3. I finally started watching. It is so good. It's so funny. It's so clever. The acting is amazing. So yeah, watch Hacks. And the other thing, which complete surprise, it's a book I picked up in a charity shop. Putting on the Ritz by Joe Keenan. A book it's very New York, very gay, very 90s. And I don't even know how to explain the plot, but it's basically a farce about these 2 young gay guys who get caught up in these in the weird lives of these incredibly rich New York families. It is so funny. Like a lunatic, I was laughing out loud on the tube several times.
I love
sitting.
these books.
It's so good. So yeah, if you want to be cheered up, Putting on the Ritz by Joe Keenan is just tremendous.
Raf, how about you?
Okay, well, I won't say the Euros.
You can say the Euros.
Well, I mean, obviously, I've been watching, enjoying some of the football, although, yeah, that's maybe not enjoying the second half of the England game. That's the wrong verb. No, but also, so when Cormac McCarthy died last year, I realised I'd never read any Cormac McCarthy. It was one of those sort of gaps. And obviously, the first thing I'd read was The Road, which is as good as everyone says. But then I've been sort of working through others, and I've just nearing the end of All the Pretty Horses, which is a Cormac McCarthy novel. And it's just really nice when you find a novelist who you kind of start to feel confident. You can just go through the back catalogue. You're going to like all of it, whatever it is. You're going to like the writing. It's going to be engaging. It's been a while since I had that, where I could just start going, I know what my next one's going to be. It's just going to be another book by the same author. So I've been really enjoying that.
Oh, a very nice recommendation. How about you, Eva?
Well, I finally got round to reading Ossian McKenna's Evenings and Weekends, and I've really enjoyed that. It's sort of like a love letter to how depressing it can be living in the London rental market and the sort of
so
pressure.
Depressing.
Yes, but it's sort of like the pressure cooker of living in that environment and the trials and tribulations of, that then, are or fall onto relationships because or encumbered by relationships because of those pressures. And I've also been enjoying the Euros, but not necessarily because of the football, but because you can go to the pub more often. And it's also so...
Yeah, that's just...
Not to be a bit twee, but I think everyone's been so busy recently that the Euros are a reason to incentivise your friends who don't normally go out to come out.
Yeah.
And that has been really lovely.
Yeah. That's very good. Mine is Mary and George. It's on Sky. Sorry, Rishi. It's the story of how... It's based on a true story about this woman basically who groomed her son, sent him to sex school in France so that he could become James I's lover. He could seduce the king and she could be powerful. And
I really thought that was contemporary for a moment until you got to the names. I was like,
It's costume, it's filthy, and the mother in question is Julianne Moore, who I would watch in anything. And it really is just tremendously disgusting fun.
James I of Scotland or James I when he was 6th and
well,
came to
James
England?
VI in Scotland,
Yes.
James I
Okay.
in...
I'm more into that time period.
Yeah. So both is the
Yeah.
answer. James VI in Scotland, James I
Got you.
down here. And there's this line in it where she says, he's so cock-struck, it's almost a curse.
I believe the millennial word now is dickmatized.
And that's the end of the Tuesday edition of Oh God, What Now? Thank you, Raf.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marie. Thank you. And Eva.
Yeah, no, thank you.
I mean, what a note to finish
Thank you,
on.
Marie.
Oh God, What Now? We'll be back on Thursday for our backers and Friday morning for everyone else. And before you go, here's a shout out to some of our new Patreon backers. You too could be the subject of a heartfelt salute at the end of the show if you support our podcast on Patreon.